It was an attack that took everyone by surprise. A three-pronged assault launched by ISIS in northern Iraq on Wednesday, leaving Canadian trainers no choice but to fight back. Two CF-18 fighter jets joined in the counteroffensive as well. But as Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan doubles down on the training assist role of the mission, does the government need to rethink its vision? What risks are involved in increasing trainers on the ground as Canadian jets withdraw from the air mission at some point? Joining me now from Toronto, John McKay. He's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Defence. James Bezan is the Conservative defence critic. He is in Winnipeg. And Randall Garrison is the NDP's defence critic in Victoria and joins us by phone tonight. Nice to have all of you to be here, gentlemen. Appreciate it. And obviously, I'll start with John McKay. Mr. McKay, what do you think this incident tells us about the risk of having more trainers on the ground and the benefit of Canada having planes?
Well, it's not without risk. There's no question about that. As the minister rightly said, it does in some ironical way show that the mission to train the fighters on the ground is actually working. It's quite clearly a decision on the part of the government to withdraw from our CF-18s. That decision was made over the course of the longest election in history, and so the strategic decision is made. The only question really remains is the tactics, and that's the when and the where and the how, and the minister is actively engaged in the when and the where and the how. We've also engaged with our allies and said that we are going to reprofile the mission. The Prime Minister has met with President Obama, 2, 3, 4 times on a variety of issues, but this one in particular. And we are recalibrating that relationship as well with some pretty positive announcements about the cool legislation and the state dinner. So we think that our allies are on side. We think that there will be a reprofiling of the mission. We think that the training part is probably the one where we can be most value add, and let's hope that we can move forward.
Okay, I'll dig into some of that, but let me get some response first from everybody else, or some reaction. James Bezan, what was your reaction to the news that Canadian forces were involved in another firefight, a much more significant one than we've seen ever, I think, at this stage?
Well, first of all, I want to salute the brave men and women of the Canadian Armed Forces, and in particular the members of the Special Operations Forces and the CF-18 pilots who were so effective yesterday in that battle. It was a major offensive, one that we haven't seen for some time, and definitely not in the north. So it's not just about ISIS trying to hold Mosul. They are trying to push on to Erbil, and because of the great training, as well as the advise and the assist, the command and control that's being offered by the Special Operations Forces, and the great precision guided bombing that was done by the CF-18s and our allied partners, we were able to push back and regain the ground that ISIS was trying to capture. But it does, again, speak to this whole narrative of, there hasn't been a very good reason, one single good reason from the Liberals during the campaign, since the bombings in Paris and Beirut and other places, or now following the attacks in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, why the CF-18 should be withdrawn. Instead of retreating, they need to keep us there in the combat mission with our CF-18s and our Special Operation Forces on the ground.
So James Bezan, if the government decides to listen to you and keep the planes there, you will not say that they've broken a campaign promise? You're willing to give them the flexibility there?
Well, the ground has shifted. The ground has shifted, and we expect them to move with the changing times. And this, again, speaks to the overall message that we want to send to our allies, that we are there to stand shoulder to shoulder with them. And we haven't seen that coming from this government. Instead, they want to step back, they want to retreat, and they have yet to lay out any details as to what the training mission is going to look like, where it's going to take place. Is it more Special Operation Forces? How many more? And we get mixed messages coming from Minister Sajjan versus Minister Dion as to what that is and what timelines we're looking at. Because we have Dion talking about pulling out the CF-18s in a matter of days or weeks, not months, and we have Sajjan yesterday saying that we're going to keep the CF-18s there probably beyond the parliamentary authorization that was granted till the end of March 2016.
Yeah, and I give you that point, and I think it's a fair one. I think there's a lack of clarity around the timeline, certainly. Let me bring in Randall Garrison before we go back to John McKay. Randall Garrison, what does this firefight indicate to you about the danger of this mission, even the way it looks right now?
Well, like James, I want to first acknowledge the fine work done by Canadian forces on the ground and in the air. What they need, and they're always ready to do, is to carry out a clear mission with a clear goal. And I think what this tells us is that the bombing hasn't been effective. If ISIS is able to mount a major offensive like this, then perhaps we're heading down the wrong path. And the government clearly promised to end the bombing mission and to come up with a different kind of mission. And what we've said all along is we have to focus on what's most effective against ISIS, and that's cutting off the flow of arms, the flow of funds, the flow of foreign fighters. And I'd like to see the Liberals take some leadership on the world stage in refocusing Canada's efforts on those things. But instead, we've got a minister who seems to be waffling on when the bombing mission's going to end, and we have a lack of clarity about training missions. We know the training mission is not just train, it's train, advise, and assist. And that inevitably raises the specter of what happened yesterday, where Canadians end up in a firefight. So we need a clear mission, and given that this was a decision by Parliament, if we're going to extend the bombing mission, that needs to come back to Parliament, and whatever kind of training mission we're talking about needs to be voted on by Parliament.
Okay, let me go back to John McKay. So just so people understand what happened, I mean, the planes that were there basically helped our soldiers stay alive, and the Kurds as well, because they helped protect them. And I want to show viewers something that the Minister of Defense said today that was particularly interesting about the effectiveness of those airstrikes. Take a look at this.
To happen to be on station, and very fortunately, it would happen to be our jets. I would have loved to be able to have our jets when I was in combat in Afghanistan, but we asked for an effect, and very fortunately, in this case here, our CF-18s were there.
So this is the part I don't understand, Mr. McKay. The defense minister who served in Afghanistan makes the point that it would have been effective and useful to have Canadian jets there protecting Canadian soldiers. In this case, that's what happened again. So isn't he making the case that in fact they should stay and that they do a good job protecting our people on the ground?
I don't think there's much argument, but that they do a good job and they do what they're asked to do. However, the question...
So then why do they have to go? Why do they have to go then?
But the larger question, Rosie, is whether this is the most effective role that Canada can play. And over the course of the last, I don't know how many days that election was, we debated this endlessly. And the clear conclusion of the Canadian people was that they wanted us to stay involved in the mission. They wanted us to stay involved in the conflict.
Except Mr. McKay, you would admit that the situation has changed, that our allies have ramped up the fight against ISIS, and that there are other things going on in the world that would allow you a moment to decide whether you need to reconsider.
There are things that change all the time, but once you arrive at a strategy, we arrived at a strategy, then you arrive, then you go to tactics.
Okay, but the government just changed its strategy on getting to $10 billion deficits. It just changed its strategy on meeting refugee promises. That's part of governing too, is adjusting for the new reality.
Well, but there are all new realities on the ground both ways for the air mission. And for instance, since the last election, the Russians are now in the air, the French are now in the air, the Turks, I'm not quite sure whether they're still in the air. There's a lot of people in the air. The issue, actually, if anything, is more compelling for us to be involved in the training of troops, because everyone says the mission is quite effective, including General Hillier. The air mission is effective, but this war is not going to be won unless the Peshmerga and the Iraqi government troops actually engage with ISIL. And the only really useful thing, and I think uniquely effective thing that Canadians can do, not the only thing, but the thing that can be most effective is the training mission of these people. And as the minister rightly pointed out, and as James and Randall rightly pointed out, the irony is that the Peshmerga were very effective last night in repelling this very significant attack.
But you could also say the irony is, Mr. McKay, that if the planes hadn't been there, there could have been death.
There would have been plane support. Let's face it, whether it's our planes or other planes.
Okay, let me bring in James Bezan on that. Do you think that do you think that Canada is in greater danger if we put more trainers on the ground, or do you think that this is the place, as Mr. McKay is pointing out, where we can be most effective and help the Kurds be able to stand on their own, which is probably the ultimate goal here? No one wants to be in this space for a long time.
No, I think that if you look at what the overall coalition partners are saying, is that it is key that everybody on the ground are the ones that are going to be able to take the fight to ISIS. And that means that the regional players, being the Kurdish Peshmerga, the Shia militia, and the Iraqi security forces are the ones that are going to have to ultimately win this war on the ground. And that's why we do support a more robust training mission, but we still don't know what that looks like. And so you know, you're listening to John, you listen to what the minister is saying there. So aside from the fact that this is ideologically driven, that they don't care who's dropping bombs as long as it's not Canadians. I think what last night showcased is that it's nice to have the ability to call in our own assets to protect our troops when they need it. And I think that really was very well documented.
And none of the Conservative government's decisions around the military were ideologically driven?
No, this is about being pragmatic and working with our coalition partners. And we were asked by we're doing exactly what we're doing today is something that we've been doing for the past year because it's what was asked of us of our coalition partners led by the United States. And that same goes back to what happened in Afghanistan. We always work as part of a coalition, picking up the load and doing what is necessary and what we're capable of. This isn't an either-or argument, Rosie, and you know, this is what the Liberals are trying to do. And really it comes back down to the reality that we can do it all, including the humanitarian assistance, including working on the refugee file, and more importantly, bringing an end to this ISIS genocide that's been conducted throughout the region.
Randall Garrison, last word to you. Do you not think what happened here makes the case that planes should stay?
Well, I think what we're looking at here is that no matter how many bombing missions there are, and no matter how well-trained local forces are, as long as ISIS can earn between $1 and $3 million a day from oil sales, and as long as there's a steady flow of arms to ISIS, it's going to be a very difficult task. So what I'd like to see Canada do is step up to organize a coalition to stop that flow of funds, stop the oil sales, and stop the flow of arms, and then ISIS will actually be degraded.
You think that's the only way to degrade ISIS? You don't think there's a military component to getting rid of ISIS?
Their ideology calls for a major military confrontation, and that actually helps to promote the recruits, and it helps them to command loyalty. If we can cut off their ability to govern that territory, they lose their legitimacy in their own prophecy. And so we've got to do that. You can't run a government, you can't run an army without arms and money, and we could lead the coalition to cut that off.
Last word to you, John McKay, just quickly. Do you have a sense of timelines in terms of the planes? Because it is true, we've heard different things from the Foreign Affairs Minister and the Defense Minister now saying today it could be as much as 6 months. What's your understanding of the timeline?
My sense of it is that both ministers and the Prime Minister are deeply engaged. They want to get it right the first time. They are engaging the allies. They are engaging CDS and all of the military side of DND. And when they are ready to proceed, they will have a plan that's in place, that will be effective, that will be Canada's new strategy going forward. And may I say, just as a side, I actually think that Randall makes a good point about cutting off the funds. Every army, every military needs funding, and it is passingly bizarre that they can still sell $1 to $3 million a day of oil and various other things. So possibly that will also be part of the strategy. I don't really know, but I do know that the minister is deeply engaged. Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thanks, gentlemen. I appreciate the robust debate on an important topic. John McKay, James Bezan, and Randall Garrison. Thank you.
Thanks, Rosemary.
Thanks, then, Rosie.
Okay, meanwhile.